right. Well, good evening and happy Advent to to the Grail Country family here. And I'm actually posting this up over on my channel as well. And I thought it'd be kind of fun. I've been, obviously I pop into Grail Country to always talk on apocalyptic themes, and that's no different today than it is any other day. But we're doing that in the context of Advent season, which is my favorite season as far as church calendar goes, where we spend time reflecting on the coming of Christ into the world, both his first and his second coming. And it's a powerful season where we get to wrestle with the problems that both comings present and learn to kind of lean into that mystery. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about that Advent season and some of the perplexities it presents to us, but also with the goal of maybe gaining some deeper understanding. So what I'm going to do tonight is kind of go through. I got a couple of prepared slides, so you can see the little slide thing up there on the screen, I hope, and get through a few key concepts, and then just invite other people to come in for a discussion. We can go for an hour or two if you guys got the time and interest. So anyway, let's go ahead and jump into just some of these basic concepts. And I want to start off with the focus here is going to be primarily the second coming. But as we look at the second coming, obviously in Advent, we're also looking to the first coming of Christ as well. But most of the problems here we're going to discuss are related to the second coming and the problems they present to us. So let's start out with the problem. And if you follow critical scholars of any kind, you're going to run into this, is the failed prophecy of Jesus, specifically where he talks about in the Olivet Discourse that all these things, this generation will not pass away until all these things occur. And that's in Luke 21. I believe it's in all versions of the Olivet Discourse. So the apocalyptic urgency, and part of this is just an interesting problem that we have to confront as Christians, because obviously we read what Jesus's words were, and they were left struggling in the wake of that now for 2 millennia. So he left his audience with this expectation that his appearance or his second coming was going to be something imminent, that was going to happen right away. This generation, as a matter of fact. So when people are talking about the apocalyptic urgency of Jesus's message and whether or not it was a failure, they've got their finger over the target of a real perplexing issue within Christian theology in general and within the Christian experience historically. And so I'm labeling this as a failed prophecy. I don't particularly believe it's a failed prophecy unless I'm trying to be playful and perverse and allow the critics their due. But I think it's important for us to wrestle with that, because obviously within a generation, whether you want to say 40, 50 years of Christ first coming into the world, he's nowhere to be found, at least not earthly in any way that would comport with what we would understand to be his own return. And so for 2,000 years, we've been struggling with this problem of delay. He didn't reappear. He didn't reappear in his own generation or in the intervening 2 millennia since. So this quote unquote failed prophecy has been one that has perplexed theologians, delighted skeptics down through the ages. And so when we're looking at the problem of whether or not this was a failed prophecy, I think its power is actually, I'm going to be a little bit daring, a little bit bold here, and not to show all of my cards, but I tend to think that its ultimate truth is disclosed in what we might call a failure, but that's okay. Time is relative, and so is the delay, right? So let's talk about the problem of delay just in general with respect to cosmic time. And I've got unfortunately, my eyes are not big enough to read what's on this screen, so I'm going to blow the layout up a little bit here. Won't be able to see if people are commenting. But let's just take 2,000 years, 2 millennia is a good slice of time. And let's play with that and see, how much of a delay we're talking about. If we're talking about a delay with respect to one human life, yes, 2,000 years is a very long time. But 2,000 years with respect to the age of the universe, the solar system, how long humans have been on Earth, geological time, all those kinds of things. All of a sudden, this time, this delay, is a delay from a certain perspective. And so I wanted to look into that. So if you were to, I had to use ChatGPT to kind of pull some of these statistics just because my maths aren't so good. But if you were to look at the universe as like a 24-hour day, 2,000 years would be barely a tenth of a second. So in the vast history of the universe, when we're talking about a problem of delay, it's relative to our experience, not necessarily relative to cosmic time. If you were to look at it in light of the total time from the beginning of our solar system, about 4.5 billion years ago, we're looking at about 4 minutes, right? Well, 4-minute delay, right? Or within modern human existence, which is about 200,000 years, we're looking at about a 30-second commercial break, right? If you were to look at all of the deep geological time on Earth and compress it into a 1,000-page book, I think that I forget what it would comprise basically, if you were to look at that relative to a 1,000-page book, you're talking about one word, right? So one word in a 1,000-page book is about the same size of the delay that we're talking about relative to just geological time. And we could continue to use some of these statistics and all those kinds of things to just draw out what we already know. Time is relative. We've known that since Einstein kind of got his start. And so the delay is an important part of the feature. And so we're sitting here 2,000 years waiting around for the guy who hasn't come, and it can be something that people from all walks of life can kind of look at as an absurdity. They don't take the second coming seriously. But I think that there was that apocalyptic urgency that existed in the early Jesus movement that has carried on down through that church history. Different church communities look at this in very different ways. But I think that those that keep that apocalyptic urgency alive and cooking are actually doing their job as Christians. So the delay is relative here, is what I'm trying to say. So when we're looking at the problem of this generation, then we can get into maybe going in and playing with, of course, my beloved Hegel. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about the power of contradiction. Oh, I just did something. I apologize. We're okay there. Okay, we're still okay. I just hit the wrong button. So if we're looking at the power of contradiction, when we look at this question of this generation will not pass away until these things are accomplished, right? There's a great paper by a philosopher, Trisocus, who writes on Hegelian identity. Go look it up if you're interested. But he, following Hegel, asserts that contradiction is the truth. And I've got a typo in there, is the truth of all other determinations of reflection. So he's following Hegel, and Hegel is basically saying, yes, truth is disclosed through a contradictory process, right? And Hegel would assert that only in the abstract can we abide by the law of non-contradiction. In reality, or all essential reality, is disclosed through a kind of a contradiction. And the truth of Calvary kind of illustrates this. We see a lot of things that really are kind of contradictory realities, the finite and the infinite in one person, God doing something that God technically can't do. God's dying on the cross. We can't separate Jesus from his own divinity. There's a series of contradictions that are kind of baked into this disclosure of this deeper truth that can't be encapsulated except in the abstract and very non-contradictory ways. So when we're looking at this generation, what we're really looking at is something profoundly, it's an expansive. If we look in the literal sense, we could say, yes, there's a contradiction, therefore a failed prophecy. But if we don't confine ourselves to just a narrow bandwidth of understanding what the truth is, in its own literal contradiction, it opens itself up to this thing that is far more universal. What is this generation actually referring to? We can't hold to it as a valid thing if we're just reading the plain sense of Jesus' words. And like any good prophet, it's not just the words that he's saying, it's the truth he's trying to convey in words in human speech. They're flimsy, right? So there's a depth of truth that Jesus is trying, I would argue, is trying to convey to us that runs deeper than just a single generation of 40 or 50 years. This generation can only be true at this point in retrospect with a far more encompassing sense than the literal. It must refer to all who belong to Jesus's generation, right? So that would be us, all of his brothers and sisters, right? So there's a sense when we're coming to the question of apocalypse in the season of Advent, where we can wrestle with the apparent contradictions. If you're not comfortable with the term contradiction, we are, we are wrestling with the tensions of living in between two realities, a first and second coming, that creates a certain kind of dynamic tension for all of us, at least all of us who belong to the Christian faith. But I think that tension itself is actually generative of something. It actually creates a certain way of being in the world that is supposed to have some good outcomes. So let's go ahead and go to the next point. So the time in between, and what I'm going to do is do a couple of quick readings, and then we can discuss this. If anybody wants to jump online, I'll go ahead and throw the link up here. Couple of quick readings, and if nobody jumps in, then we'll just have a quick Grail Country discussion, but I'll go ahead and post this up here for now. So if you guys want to jump into the studio, we'd love to have you. So the time in between, right? So Advent is an apocalyptic season that looks back on Christ's first coming and looks forward to the time of his return. So we're in this in-between time where we contemplate the Paschal mystery. Paschal is my last name, so I'm always, when I hear those terms in church, I'm like, oh, they're talking about something I know about. The Paschal mystery is the whole mystery of Christ, which, by the way, if you want to read about the whole mystery of Christ, pick up Jordan's book. It's a great book. Recommend it to anybody. If you want to get into the mysteries of what incarnation, the full mystery of what incarnation means, I think Jordan does a better job than anybody exploring that. But we have this posture of both waiting, because we're kind of waiting for something to happen, right? So the imagery that comes a lot in the season of apocalypse, or the season of Advent, is this apocalyptic image of the watchtower. We're waiting for something foreboding. We're watching as history has unfolded before our eyes. We're historically conscious people here in the modern world. And we look at the history of what's happened since Calvary, or even since before Calvary. And we see this history of God working in and through the lives of ordinary people and extraordinary events and all that kind of stuff. And we see a certain measure of God's work in our time. But we also see the darkness encroaching in. And so Advent is that kind of time where we're dealing with these kind of dualities, these kinds of contradictions that reveal a higher truth. And that apocalyptic watchtower is we're standing and watching. There is something about the second coming that is a pure miracle that only God can bring about. It's something that he brings about in the fullness of time. And I'm going to read a quick selection from Fleming Rutledge briefly on this. And then I'm going to follow it with a reading of Berdayev, and to wrap it up quickly. But that waiting piece is difficult because at the same time that we're called to wait patiently for something, we're called also to be active. We're called to be laboring in the Lord's vineyard, employing our creative energy as our effort to play our part in its overall completion. And it's our creativity in the world. And I'm going to get into a little bit more of what that might look like, or that might mean here shortly. So we're going to read a little bit on Berdayev. So Berdayev and Rutledge are going to sound very different, even contradictory at points, but I want us to kind of use them and what they're talking about in these readings to gain a better sense of what we do in this time in between. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that selection from Fleming Rutledge. Give me just a moment for the Kindle to wake up here. Okay, so Fleming Rutledge wrote a fantastic book on Advent. If you're looking for Advent reading material, Fleming Rutledge's book is fantastic. This comes out of a sermon that she delivered. Give me just a second here. I texted Nate today. He's evidently coming home from the hospital, so continue to send your prayers. And I don't have further update than that, but we did briefly have an exchange today, so we'll continue to keep Nate in our prayers. And yes, if I get more updates, I'll let you guys know. So anyway, so this comes from her sermon, Waiting and Hastening, right? And this was delivered in the second Sunday of Advent, 1999. And I'm going to read about 3 or 4 pages here. So it's a little bit of a longer reading, but just hang in there if you want to stick through the discussion. So Fleming Rutledge in her sermon says this: as a general rule, Americans are a people of action. We don't like long lunches like the French. We don't take siestas like the Spanish. We don't look forward to our pensions like the English. We don't wait for the crosswalk to change like the Germans. Is there anyone I haven't offended yet? All kidding and stereotyping aside, I think it's safe to say that we Americans think of ourselves as busy, 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 making things happen. We are the go-go people, and we're a bit impatient with those who aren't full of energy like we are. We don't like passivity. We don't like waiting around. So the theme of waiting and watching that permeates the Advent season strikes a false note with us. We give lip service to it, but we don't take it seriously. We don't want to sit around watching and waiting. We want to speed things up. We want to move things along. If God isn't going to bring the kingdom, we'll bring it down ourselves. That's our American way. I don't mean this lightly. I think we need to ask ourselves seriously, what are we going to do with this tiresome Advent refrain about waiting and watching? Most of the readings at this time of the church year sound on that note. You've heard it for 3 Sundays in a row, and we meet it again today from the epistle in 2 Peter. The bridegroom has been delayed. The master is a long time coming, a lot longer than we expected. Shouldn't we forget about the theme of the second coming and get on with the job ourselves? And isn't that a good reason for being Episcopalian? She's an Episcopalian preacher, by the way. Isn't that a good reason for being Episcopalians instead of fundamentalists? We don't believe in this business about the second coming, do we? That is the question that the preacher must ask herself at this time of the church year, because Advent is not really the season about preparing for Jesus's birth, as though it had never come in the first place. Advent is the season of preparation for his coming again. Whenever I undertake this sermon on this theme, I must examine my own heart and mind. You may think that preachers just get up and say these things as a matter of course, but that's not so. I'm a modern urban person like you. I don't want to be classified with the Christian right or the sectarian fanatics. Do I really believe Jesus is coming back, not just coming to individual souls one by one in their own hearts, but coming to call the entire universe into judgment, coming to bring history as we know it to a close, coming to bring his everlasting kingdom to pass? That's what the New Testament sets before us, not a private, invisible, spiritualized coming, but a cosmic event that will be visible to everyone. Every eye will now behold him, robed in dreadful majesty. This is the claim that the church makes. This claim that the church makes is too serious to fool around with. And here I really agree with her. If we don't mean it, we should put an end to Advent. We should take out the phrase out of the Nicene Creed, he will come again with glory to judge the living and the dead. We shouldn't say that every Sunday if we don't believe it. The second epistle of Peter, appointed for today, is the last piece of the New Testament to be written, and it addresses several familiar questions. Why has so much time gone by? Why has Christ not come back? Is he really going to come back? Isn't the creation just going to go along on its own? Mockers and scoffers will come in the last day, writes the apostle, saying, where is the promise of his coming? You Christians are absurd. Say, these scoffers, Only the gullible and superstitious believe such things. So you see, we are not the first to be skeptical about the second coming. I will tell you honestly, I very often ask myself, who am I kidding? An actual day of judgment? Jesus coming with the clouds of heaven? The kingdoms of this world becoming the kingdoms of our Lord? The Bible offers no proof of this, and the entire apparatus of modern science would seem to undermine it so conclusively that we would be fools to go on believing it. Rereading 2 Peter, however, I was caught by a surprise once again, as I have been so many times before by the scripture. The writer who speaks for the Apostle Peter says, "For we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his mystery." Here, in just one verse, are the factors that keep me coming back again and again to a position of trust in spite of many doubts. There's something different about the tone of the New Testament witness, something out of the ordinary. These men and women were staking their very lives literally on something that had been corroborated by other witnesses whom they in turn trusted. It's not cult-like or weird, however. There is something sober, worldly about the New Testament. It is an atmosphere that you would not call quote unquote religious at all. It is much more straightforward. It is full of real people with real faults, recognizably like ourselves, who nevertheless have a report to make. We are not following a myth. We were eyewitnesses of his majesty. We are testifying of his power and his future coming. The more I read the Bible, the more I trust the sobriety of these witnesses, their plainness, their lack of ostentation. It is a world away from the self-absorbed spiritual writers of today like Deepak Chopra or Marianne Williamson. Actually, I kind of like both of them, but that's okay. Trusting in the apostolic testimony then means entering upon a life lived in the expectation of Christ's coming. And this brings us back to the very un-American idea of waiting. The first Sunday of Advent focuses on this theme. The gospel lesson on that day always contains these words of Jesus: "Of that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Take heed, watch, for you do not know when the time will come. And what I say to all, watch, wait, keep awake." A related Advent image is that of the watchman who sits all night looking for the dawn. It all sounds very passive, as though there were nothing to do. And so we come to our passage today from 2 Peter with a fascinating pair of matched but opposing words. Listen for them. Since all these things are to thus be dissolved, what sort of persons ought you to be in lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be kindled and dissolved, and the elements will melt with fire. But according to his promise, we wait for a new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. Waiting and hastening. How can you wait and hasten at the same time? That, my fellow Americans, is the secret of the Christian life. Knowing how to keep those two modes in creative tension, waiting for and hastening the coming day of God. This is so typical of Advent, the time of contrasts and opposites, darkness and light, good and evil, past and future, now and not yet. Finding the right balance between waiting and hastening is the challenge of our existence in the body of Christ, in the body of Christ until he comes again. We might call it action in waiting. The action part, the hastening part, is easy for us. That's what we understand. Tear down that old building, open up that new branch, build a new parking garage, start a new ad campaign, test the latest brand, move it, we say. We're used to thinking in terms of hastening. The hard part is this waiting. What is the point of waiting? What are we waiting for? Why not get on with whatever it is? Whatever it is this, the new heavens and the new earth in which righteousness dwells. And no one can bring that about except for God. Every year, the Christmas cards go out, peace on earth. And maybe we Americans can fool ourselves that there can be such a thing, but that would be to ignore the fact that 3/4 of the world's population is living in misery. Maybe there are some who think that humankind can accomplish peace on earth, but I don't know who they are. Not after the century we just lived through. At the turn of the last century, plenty of people thought that an age of peace and harmony was just around the corner, but not anymore after millions dead in the First World War, millions in the Holocaust, millions in Stalin's Gulag, millions more in Mao's China, another million in Cambodia, and another million in Rwanda. It is a commonplace now to hear that the 20th century is described as the most violent and murderous in history. As Jason Epstein points out in his compelling recent essay, Always a Time to Kill, there is no end to human wickedness or folly. The waiting of the Christian church, therefore, is the waiting and longing and hoping expressed in the haunting cry at the very end of the Bible, Maranatha. Come, Lord Jesus. Not until the final intervention of God in the last day will the true and lasting peaceable kingdom come. That is the not yet of Advent. That is why we wait. Thou must save, and thou alone. We come to our climactic question: if only God can bring peace and goodwill, if only God can create a new heaven and a new earth in which righteousness dwells, then what is the point of our doing anything? If there's nothing we can do to improve the situation, then we really might as well withdraw into a private world of gated communities, exclusive clubs, and personal privilege, and enjoy it as best we can before we are overtaken by cancer or senility. Here's what the action in waiting comes in: the hastening. It's all a matter of what we're pointing toward. Let us look for another moment at another section in 2 Peter, speaking of the promises of God. The apostolic writer writes or says, we have the prophetic word made more sure. Pay attention to this as a lamp shining in a dark place until the day dawns and the morning star arises in your heart. There is the Advent message right there. Hark, a thrilling voice is sounding, Christ is nigh. It seems to say, cast away the works of darkness, O ye, the children of day. The church responds to the thrilling voice by doing the works of the day, the works of light, the ministry to the prisoners, the soup and the sandwiches for the hungry, the houses for the low-income families, the birthday parties for the children who have no parties. These are the lamps shining in the dark places. These are the works that glorify Christ while we wait for him. This is action while waiting. So that's a reading from Fleming Rutledge's book on Advent. Again, great resource. And there is a sense where our Christian lives are bracketed by this sense of waiting. We're waiting for the promises of God to come about in our own lives. We're waiting for something out there to happen. There's so much in this world that's beyond our control, and we look to a God who can bring that story to its proper closure and its proper end. And there isn't much we can do for most of us on that front to, shift the tides of history and those kinds of things. What we do is we wait, but we're also supposed to hasten. So what does that look like? And I really enjoy Nicholas Berdyaev, the great Russian existentialist philosopher. He was a compatriot of Sergei Bulgakov. And I'm going to go ahead and read a section from him because he's going to take a little bit of a different angle that may say a few things a little differently than Fleming Rutledge, but I also think is a valuable voice to consider. So let me go ahead and pull that up. Check my page marks here. And then we'll open this up for discussion here in just a couple of minutes. Page 35. Okay, so this is from a little book called Creativity Will Save the World. It's a collection of Berdyaev's essays. And this comes from an essay titled Creativity and Redemption. And hey, Sherry, how are you doing? And everybody in the comments, thanks so much. I'm gonna actually, let me go ahead and post this back up because we're just about to open things up. And if anybody wants to pop in, welcome to join and discuss this a little bit. But we're going to look at what Berdyaev has to say, and this is going to be more on the hastening side, and he's so fascinating. So I'm going to read this couple of sections from this essay. New Testament Christianity is a religion of redemption. The good news of salvation from sin, the revelation of the Son of God, the second hypostasis of the Holy Trinity, in the aspect of God's suffering for the sins of the world. This is one of the stages on the spiritual road. But does the mystery of salvation take in the whole life? Is life's final purpose only salvation from sin? Redemption from sin, salvation from evil are in themselves negative, and the final aims of life being far beyond, and a positive creative purpose. The absolute Christian truth turns on the one hand towards redemption from sin and evil, and on the other towards our positive creative calling. It reveals a Christology of mankind. There is not one word in the gospel about creativeness. By no amount of sophism can we derive from the gospel creative challenges and imperatives. That the ways of creativeness are hidden in New Testament Christianity is providential. Mankind's creative activity has no holy scriptures. Its ways are not revealed to us from above. In creativeness, we are, as it were, left to ourselves alone, have no direct aid from on high. And this fact is the great in this fact, the great wisdom of God is evident. We feel the holy authority of the gospel's silence about creativeness. This absolute silence of Holy Scripture about our creative activity is divinely wise. And to discern the all-wise meaning of this silence is to discern the mystery about all of us. It is an act of our highest self-consciousness. In this way, the creativeness, if the ways of creativeness were indicated in the Holy Scriptures, then creativeness would be obedience, which is to say, there would be no creativeness. He goes on to say a lot more provocative things, and I'm going to continue and pick up on that same thread a few pages down the line here. Make sure I'm getting my... Yeah. So skipping ahead a little bit here for a few pages ahead. Just a moment here. There we go. Burdide goes on to say, the world has not yet seen a religious epoch of creativeness. The world knows only the religious epochs of the Old Testament law and New Testament redemption. The world has lived in either religious obedience or sinful disobedience. We are standing on the threshold of a world epoch of religious creativeness, on a cosmic divide. Up to now, all the creativeness of culture has only been a preparatory hint, the sign of the real creativeness of another world. In the creativeness of culture, there is expressed only the tragic dualism of our nature, struggling to escape from the fetters of necessity, but not yet attaining another sphere of being. Just as the bloody pagan sacrifice was merely a foreshadowing of the world's true redemption through Christ's sacrifice on Golgotha, a foreshadowing which did not attain true redemption, so our creative efforts, which have been brought into being the values of culture, have been up to now only a foreshadowing of the true religious creative epoch, which will realize another sphere of being. The religious epoch of creativeness will be a transition into another sphere of being, not only merely to another culture or another sphere of science and art. The religious epoch of creativeness is a third revelation, an anthropological revelation following those of the Old and New Testament. The ancient world moved towards redemption before the appearance of Christ, so the new world moves toward creativeness. But it has not yet known, nor could it know, creativeness until there was a cosmic anthropological turning point, until there was a great revolution in consciousness. Then it will be seen that creativeness of culture was a poor substitute for the creativeness of being. In this epoch of law and redemption, when our creative powers were still suppressed. From this tragic problem of Christianity, there can only be one way out: the religious acceptance of the truth that the religious meaning of life and being is not wholly a matter of redemption from sin, that life and being have positive creative purposes. That higher creative positive being, though unattainable at the time when redemption was begun, when God was still transcendent to us, is attainable in another period of religious life after the redemption, when God in us is immanent. Salvation from sin, from perdition, is not the final purpose of religious life. Salvation is always from something, and life should always be for something. Many things are unnecessary for salvation. Many things unnecessary for salvation are needed for the purpose for which salvation is necessary, for the creative upsurge of being. Our chief end is not to be saved, but to mount up creatively. The third creative revelation in the Spirit will have no holy scripture. It will be no voice from on high. It will be accomplished in humanity. It is an anthropological revelation, an unveiling of the Christology of mankind. God awaits the anthropological revelation from us, and we cannot expect to have it from God. Very interesting and provocative things here. I'm going to continue for just a couple more paragraphs. And one cannot merely wait for the third revelation. We must accomplish it ourselves, living in the Spirit, accomplishing it by a free and creative act. In this act, everything transcendent will become immanent. We are quite free in the revelation of our creativeness. In this fearful freedom lies all of our godlike dignity and all of our dread responsibility. The virtue of accepting a dangerous position, the virtue of daring to do, is the basic virtue of the creative epoch. Only we who possess these virtues will vision the coming Christ. Only to us will the mighty and glorified Christ come. We who coward-like refuse the terrible burden of the final freedom cannot be oriented toward the coming Christ. That person is not making ready Christ's second coming. Only a sacrificial resolve to take a risky and dangerous place, to sail away from safe shores towards an unknown yet undiscovered continent, which no helping hands reach out. Only this terrible liberty makes man worthy to see the absolute man, in whom, he's speaking of Christ here, the absolute man, in whom is finally revealed the creative secret of mankind. The coming of Christ will reveal Christ's creative mystery to we who ourselves do daring deeds of creativeness, who are preparing a new heaven and new earth. Our creativeness in the Spirit, in the higher spiritual life, is preparing for the second coming of Christ. The way to the second coming requires active courage. We are not called to merely wait and have a presentiment, but to act and to create. We must move out of a religious and passive receptive condition into one of religious activity and creativeness. God gave us the gracious aid of Christ's redemption, which restored our fallen nature. Through the redemption, our creative freedom is restored to us. And the time must come in the world for this creative freedom to be active. We must create that for which we were redeemed, for which we were created. Christianity makes God immanent in our nature and hence cannot admit a completely transcendent separation between this world and the next. The question of religious meaning, of creativeness, has never been put. Such a question has never arisen in our consciousness. This is the question of our time. One question, the final question to which the crisis of all culture leads us. The religious problem of creativeness is a problem of the ways another kind of religious experience building up another kind of being. Creativeness is neither permitted nor justified by religion. Creativeness itself is religion. Creative experience is a special kind of experience, a special kind of way. The creative ecstasy shatters the whole world of our being. It is an outbreaking into another world. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. So we get two different kind of visions here between Fleming Rutledge, whose emphasis is more on the waiting part that we're not very good at as modern American people. And then we get Berdyaev, who's like, this wild, creative, existential philosopher who is saying, hey, God is at work in us, in and through our creativity. And these are the kinds of things that I think we live in, this in-between tension, right? The in-between tension that drives us both to look back at what Calvary, what the birth of Christ in this world means. But as we look ahead to, what is coming in the future, we're left in this in-between tension. And it's that tension that I believe generates that creative possibility for engaging in the world in new and exciting ways. And it doesn't have to be on grand scale. We each are kind of given a world of our own, and how we respond and how we act and how we behave within that world creatively shapes it around us. So it's not necessarily going out and building great, massive new structures. If you can do that, great. It's not about, fantastic works of art, although it includes that. It can be as simple as being creative in the way you live your life, in the way you engage your relationships, in seeing that there's a new possibility afoot because the kingdom of God is at hand now. And so what is Christ's answer for us in the in-between time? Since it's Advent, I couldn't resist Incorporating this will be the last piece, and we'll bring everybody in here. Christ's answer to the waiting world, Aerocras. Now, what is that? If you're not from one of the great traditions in the church, this comes out of the O Antiphon tradition, which we will all be celebrating, or a lot of us will be celebrating here in church on Sunday. The O Antiphons are an ancient tradition in the church, a series of 7 vocative prayers, antiphonally read or sung by the congregation. And it falls under these different categories. I'm not going to read the text of the liturgy, but I would encourage anybody who is looking for a Sunday service or looking for some way to get enriched. The O Antiphons are fantastic. I actually use them in my daily meditations as well. But what's kind of interesting is if you take all of these Latin statements in order from the bottom up, it comes up with this statement, Aerocras, which in Latin means, today I come. So we wait, we pray, and we hasten. And Jesus' answer is, today I come. And that's mystically true now, but it's also we await the further revelation of that final and deeper truth. So I'm going to go ahead and put a pin in that now. I'm going to go ahead and repost the link here. If anybody would like to jump in and discuss, I would love that. Because we're in that season of waiting. I'm always on these apocalyptic themes here. But wanted to just see what that waiting and what that hastening might look like for each of you. So feel free to jump in. I'm going to go ahead and push that back in here. I'm hoping I have having that correct. Is anybody wanting to come in? I'll give it a couple of minutes here. Wipe my whistle. Remove that out. Oh goodness, we went for like 40 minutes. We'll go through some of these comments here. Yeah. I use the PowerPoint stuff more for myself than I do for others, just to keep myself on topic, because I tend to ramble so much. I appreciate that. Abby, you had a lot of great comments in here. Yes. And it's that creative act that I think is really what excites me about engaging and living in the world as a lowly middle manager. I try to take my approach to my vocation and my other creative pursuits as a way of kind of hastening that. And I realize that sounds strange, but the way we got Sherry's going to go ahead and jump in here in a couple of minutes. But yeah, so engaging in the world in a way that in some small way is a preparation for the coming of Christ. And then by some small way, like I said, that can be the cup of cold water to the thirsty child. That could be, composing the grand symphony, whatever it is that we engage in our day-to-day lives. That's where the creative action is. I think Berdyaev is probably talking about big, bold, creative, artistic acts at some level, but a little bit deeper level. I think that the life of creativity is a profoundly constructive part of the kingdom of God. It's our work within it, and it's more about not just a specific creative work, but it's more about a life that is lived. I hope that makes sense. Fantastic. So in between instants. Jesus's logos is always present. So his presence is that, a lot of times is that tension, is that mystery, as we're waiting for Sherry here. The link needs to go back up here. Let me know. I know dead air is like the worst thing in the world, but I don't have a ton of other things to say right at the moment. And that's really it, isn't it, Abby? Like this is kind of where we have to embrace again these tensions, the deep tension between, you know, I don't know about you, but my my YouTube feed is filled with a lot of critical scholarship among biblical scholars, because it's an area that I'm very interested in. And you know, and a lot of times they're trying to combat what they view as absurdity among fundamentalist circles about, you know, various views about scripture, and they go about their, you know, their critical scholarly process of trying to dismantle everything. That's what a critic does, and try to disenchant their audiences of the idea that this question of the return is a valid one, or maybe not trying to do that specifically, but at least presenting information that will accomplish that for a lot of people within their audiences. But I'm constantly left with the questions myself of like, yeah, but that's only if you grant your very specific, narrow assumptions about what this text is, what it means, right? And I think in some sense it's just easier to deal with the mystery of all of this stuff by breaking it down into these small bits that we can then just dust away and say that's what was said a couple thousand years ago by a failed apocalyptic prophet, right? And that is a predominant critical view, and at some level I understand why they say that, but I think that you can only arrive at that conclusion within the narrow constraints of a critical framework. And that the words of Jesus, they tend to be this haunting effect in human history and in our own lives that make us uncomfortable, that put us in that position where we want to do, but we have these limitations of what we can do, and we have to wait at the same time. And I find that tension. There's a really good book. I work in the business sector. There's a really good book by a guy named Roger L. Martin called The Opposable Mind. And it just talks about the ability to hold conflicting ideas in your mind at the same time is a mark of an effective business manager, right? But I think that bigger principle is also true in life, is a lot of times we need to have the ability to hold more than one idea in our mind at the same time. And they're not always going to line up nicely, but sometimes there's a deeper truth in the contradiction that happens between those two concepts. So, Jan God, my understanding of that, the Alpha and Omega passage in the book of Revelation, and this again is just my limited understanding, but it's a play off of a word play off of a quotation in Isaiah that's also repeated in the book of Revelation, that I am the first and the last. And so it looks like, you know, the author of the Apocalypse played off of those concepts using, you know, the Greek alphabet. So I think that's how that may be developed, at least for that author. But it's predominantly out of Isaiah. Basically, like if you're looking at the book of Revelation, I would look at it as a commentary on the Hebrew scriptures. And so a lot of the deeper concepts are going to be ones that are rooted in some way in the earlier scriptures. Book of Isaiah being predominant. Book of Daniel is also all over the place in that work. Let me see here. Got Sherry coming on in just a moment. But you guys can throw out some topics here while we're waiting. I'm going to go ahead and get my nicotine pouch here. And I'll go ahead and post these notes here on the. I'll try to post them in the comment section once the video posts as well. So we'll get going here in just a couple more minutes with Sherry. So go ahead and kind of sit back, enjoy yourselves. Anybody else that would like to jump in? Once again, we'd love to open this one up. Let's see if I missed anyone else here. Now you guys all get to experience the uncomfortableness of waiting. Yes, I do. I wish there was like some background music I could play. Or I'm not a good dancer, so you guys wouldn't want me to dance. Oh, and we got Sherry.
Hello.
I was running out of things to say and kind of flew through that material. How you doing, Sherry?
I'm doing good. How are you, Jed?
I'm doing okay.
Yeah.
Just enjoying this holiday. So
yeah, that's cool. I'm glad you're holidaying.
Yeah.
Looks like
Yeah.
it.
A whole day where I didn't have to work. It was I almost didn't know what to do with myself.
Yeah. Oh, I'm just trying to see here. Hang on. Yeah. I made myself a coffee and then my husband came home and I had to say hello before I jumped on.
It's usually nice to say hello to the husband.
Mm-hmm. I know, eh? So I heard, I was listening right up to the last minute there where I had to go, but you were talking about holding tensions.
Right. Well,
that was great.
I was kind of playing with the concepts, like, as we get into Advent season, which is like my favorite season as far as church calendar season. It's just I don't know, it's a magical time of year, and I love Christmas. I love the whole, the pageantry and like the beauty of like the liturgies at Christmas time. They're just always very moving for me.
Yeah.
But a lot of times, like as I've become, kind of moved into like more of Episcopal churches, like, kind of got introduced to more of the apocalyptic themes that are inherent in Advent, that we're not just really looking back to when Christ came, in his first Advent, but we're also looking to that second coming. And if we're honest with ourselves, like that seems like a really long time ago, and why are we still hoping for this thing to happen when it hasn't happened yet? And what does it mean when it does happen? And
how about what is supposed to happen?
Right.
I mean, you were talking about creativity, the Berdyaev piece. I really enjoyed that, actually. And it reminded me of, I watched a podcast with Rick Beato and Ted Gioia called Only Creative People Will Save Us. And they were pointing at, I mean, if I could summarize it in a nutshell, it's a long conversation, actually. They were pointing out the fact that, with AI, and of course they're both music critics, and what AI is doing to the music industry. And then of course they went into some other things. They were talking about how the fakery will lead to a yearning for the real, essentially. Right. And then you were talking about holding tensions. And what was going through my mind with both of those thoughts was that you can't hold attention in a place of perfect peace.
Right.
So there has to be a conflict.
Right.
And then the other thing that came to my mind was, we're told that we can have the peace that passes understanding, right? And the point that I've made about that in the past is that it passes understanding because it happens at a time when you shouldn't really feel it. Right. So to me, all those things point to troublesome times.
Right. Well, that makes me think of, like, I was just talking a little bit earlier, and I didn't, at some point, maybe I floated the idea of a conversation with Jordan Wood on this, just because I know Jordan deals with Hegel quite a bit.
Yeah.
But Hegel's so insistent, and I used to be very resistant to this idea, and it just was abhorrent to me. But that truth is fundamentally revealed in contradiction.
Yeah.
And so,
do you think, here's another thought though, too. Anything is revealed when it's held up against its contrasting, like its opponent,
right.
Like, yeah, you need a contrast, right? You need something to contrast it to. Unless, of course, well, there is also the idea of having spiritual sight versus regular sight.
Right.
Yeah, but I don't know how that fits in at the moment. But anyway.
Well, I think that contradictory piece, like I think if like I take kind of, more of that creative, poetic sensibility, contradiction is like vital to poetry. Like you have to kind of you have to trade in these things because you're trying to tell a bigger truth. And sometimes you're going to use very disparate and incoherent aspects to paint a coherent picture with your words. And so I've come to a place where I can embrace the fact that maybe at some level things are contradictory, right? And for Hegel, what he would say is that only in the abstract does the law of non-contradiction apply. When it comes to the essential reality, when it comes to being itself, for Hegel, that is a disclosure that happens solely through the mechanism of contradiction. And I think if you play with those concepts, I mean, you could probably take Hegel too far. And I'm not saying everybody needs to pick up Hegel and read him for God's sake. That's a long, difficult slog. But if we look at just Calvary itself, I feel like we're seeing all the contradictions of the world converging on one point, and one fundamental truth is being told from that space. But if you're looking for like a non-contradictory approach to that, you're going to make a mess of what's happening at Calvary. It's a lot of things are all happening at once, and very opposing realities are converging into this one disclosure. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, as we look at those questions of the second coming and the waiting, are we active? Are we just passively waiting for this thing to happen? Are we active while it's happening? And the answer is yes. Yeah. Like we have to actively wait. And what that is manifest in our creativity.
Right. And you also pointed out that it is, I don't know if you use this word or not, but that it's an individual move too. Right. Like I just keep getting the image of the temple not made by hands as well. I mean, I could just say the way Soloviev does, divine humanity, right?
Right.
So, but that is a building that is made. Well, every building is made from parts, right? It is a building made by many living stones.
Right.
So, yeah. I'll just leave it at that.
Well, and Berdyaev goes, he's in that same school as Soloviev and Bulgakov. He goes a step further and speaks of Christ as disclosing a Christology of humanity in whole.
Yes.
That Jesus is in the process of making us like himself.
Yes.
Which means that whatever Jesus is, he's making us into that.
Well,
he's opening that reality up to us.
Right. And he's described as the firstborn, right? Of creation.
Oh, I'll leave that up there for a little bit.
Yeah, let me read that. Yes, exactly. The 4 levels of interpretation. Thanks, right. Origin.
Some things the church we've never really massively improved on. That fourfold senses. We used to. I remember being in an evangelical Bible college, and we were railing against that. And it all had to be it all had to be, it was the literal, universal or plenary inspiration of Scripture, that it was true at the literal level.
Right.
And we had to defend that. And that's where you inevitably run into these very difficult and thorny contradictions that you in some way have to kind of explain away and chase them away, because it's a sign of unbelief. But that older fourfold sense of, you got to account for the literal, you got to know what the words on the page are saying, but there's these higher senses of Scripture that we then are trying to ascend into, where God is disclosing himself through the work of the Spirit. And
well, I had a conversation with Evgeny Terkin yesterday about the story of Cosmo, and he was pointing out something else in the story of Phantastes, where there was a part where Anotos ends up in the little cottage of a man and a woman who live on the edge of Fairy, and she says that if she couldn't breathe the air of Fairy, she would be sick. She has to be close to the air of Fairy in order to breathe it. Mm-hmm. And when he was, in order to be healthy, sorry. And when he was talking about that, I was like, oh, that's so interesting, because that's kind of what the Eucharist demands of us, mm-hmm. right? We have to breathe the air of Fairy when it comes to the Eucharist. Because what it reminded me of was that verse in Corinthians where he talks about some were sick and some were asleep in the church, because, they weren't coming with the right heart, let's say. And so when he read that, or when he talked about that part of the book, that verse came to my mind right away. And I'm like, oh, interesting. Because the air of Fairy is a sense of enchantment, essentially. Mm-hmm. And you have to bring that to the Eucharist, mm-hmm. in order to understand it. I just know this from my own journey, mm-hmm. because I had to bring the air of Fairy to the Theotokos, to iconography, to many things that I wasn't used to, because I became an Orthodox Christian. Before mm-hmm. that, I wasn't an Orthodox Christian, and mm-hmm. I didn't understand it. And so I came with enchantment, so that it could reveal itself to me. Because if I don't have that, I can't see, right? Mm-hmm. I had another thought about that, but now it just slipped my mind. But I don't know how you feel about that. I want to put it, I'm putting it in fairy tale terms.
Well, I have a question then, just related to that. So if you're taking an enchanted view to the Eucharist, which I think is a lovely idea, I encourage everyone to do that. What are some ways that enchanted view has maybe enhanced your experience of the Eucharist, and maybe how that's impacted your outlook?
Well, let me go back a little bit before I answer that, because I think we could explore it better if we thought about it in terms of imagination, of bringing the right imagination into, right? Because what was it that Berdyaev said in that essay that you read about the transcendent becoming immanent?
Right. So Berdyaev's his argument is essentially that prior to the advent of Christ in the world, God was wholly transcendent. Now, you could probably pick apart those ideas, but that's his argument, is that prior to Christ coming in the world, God was wholly transcendent, but mm-hmm. now in Christ, God has become immanent within us.
Right. Okay. So that's what imagination affords one, right? Mm-hmm. It makes the transcendent immanent. Like this is what, I can speak for George MacDonald, especially because I've focused mostly on his fairy tales, mm-hmm. but also other fairy tales. That what they're doing is taking the transcendent and they're making it immanent, mm-hmm. right? Through enchantment. And so, there's a description in Fantastes where he's in the fairy castle and he goes into this fairy library and he pulls out this fairy book and he reads the story of Cosmo, which is essentially the story of Christ. And I've always had the sense that the fairy castle and the fairy library and the fairy stories are all the scriptures.
Okay.
For him.
Okay.
Right? And he says, as a Nodos, when he started reading the story of Cosmo, he felt like he was reading his story. And that, and Cosmo is a type of Christ, right? The story of Cosmo is a type of Christ.
Yeah.
So, and we can do that. We do that readily when we are given permission to do that. It's like, okay, now we're reading a fairy tale, right? And like, woe unto he or she who would call the Bible a fairy tale. But essentially it is, because it's like Upcycle said, it's a multi-layered, many levels, right, of interpretation, which and I don't know, maybe this is a jump, but which to me is like the descent from the spheres down to the earth, down through the heavenly spheres, right? The heavenly layers to the earth, which is an image of incarnation. When matter becomes, because as the person descends down from the heavenly spheres, here their bodies are lighter. And in every way, like weight-wise and actually light. And as they descend, they become darker and more dense.
Cooler and more dense.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's because they become only matter. And that's what materialism does. And that's what George MacDonald has shown me through his stories, is that the disenchantment comes when the shadow, which is sin, right? Which is missing the point, not seeing something for what it actually is, because that's how he would phrase it.
Yeah.
And what it actually is enchanted, right? And so that's how I get to seeing the Eucharist as breathing the air of fairy. And I've actually posed the question on the Discord and in other places, how much do we believe in fairies? Right?
Yeah.
And everyone struggles with that. But if you ask them if they believe in God, they're like, oh, I believe in God. But it feels almost to me like a shield of protection to say that I believe in God. Nobody can say with certainty that they believe in fairies. I can't say I believe in fairies, but I would like to believe in fairies. And so I try to believe in fairies. Right?
Yeah.
And I look for fairies.
Well, have you seen any?
I haven't seen any that I can speak of.
Yeah, they're that's an interesting. I've run into people who've seen them. I've maybe have imagined I've seen them, or I've had experiences where out in the forest
I've met children who have seen them and who have seen things that I can't see.
So, and this is what's interesting to me, by the way. Yes, we love hearing Sherry think out loud all the time. But what I find interesting, Sherry, and I'm sure that this probably runs true at some level in whatever Sherry's life looks like on the ground, right, is if you're taking that enchanted view of the Eucharist, right, and this will tie into that creativity piece, right? You're actively engaging the imagination in worship. You're actively engaging the imagination when you read and when you learn. And that tells you something. It's kind of like the image of, John of Patmos eating the scroll. He's ingesting the book. It's becoming a part of him, right? He's engaging the word at such a level that he's actually taking it into himself. Mm-hmm. Right. The same kind of thing with the Eucharist is actually something we're meant to eat. We're taking it within ourselves, and we're invited to be assimilated into that reality as it assimilates into us. Right. I'm sure that plays itself out in your day-to-day life.
Yeah.
Right. Whether it's the way you treat your animals, or you treat your husband, or the way you engage life on the farm, the way you engage here in these creative communities. Mm-hmm. And that's an example. That would be like one example of what the creative life can look like. Unless I'm mistaken, that you haven't written any major books or works of literature.
Well, I made this sweater. That's pretty creative.
But you've got these things that they brighten the world. These are little signposts of a coming kingdom. This is what it's like. It'd be like, what's heaven like? Well, it's probably a lot like hanging out with Sherry on the farm. Right.
Yeah. Well, but here's the thing though. There's a choice to be made about all of it, right? Like you can't just expect it to hit you over the head. I mean, it might hit you over the head, but it might not be pleasant. Mm-hmm. But there's a choice to be made. And this is where I find it interesting. Like when Upcycle was talking about the different levels of interpretation, how did he put it? In interpreting the Bible, the four senses of Scripture form a comprehensive framework focusing on 4 levels of interpretation: literal, allegorical, is it topological or
tropological?
Tropological and anagogical. And what I find, so there's a group of people out there that I used to be a part of who only understood it as a literal thing. And then there's a group of people who want to understand it as the other 3, but not the literal thing. Mm-hmm. And that's where the question, do you believe in fairies, comes in. Mm-hmm. Do you?
Oh, yeah.
Right? Do you literally believe in fairies? and the choice happens when you say yes to that. Yes, I do. Yeah. I literally believe in fairies. And, I was sitting out by our lake here, and I was thinking about this. I was thinking about fairies, and I was thinking about believing in fairies, and I was thinking about what it means to live in an enchanted world and how the transcendent can become immanent. And it was cold, and the lake was slightly frozen, like the whole was covered with ice, but just a thin sheet. Mm-hmm. And the sun came out, and as soon as the sun came out, this little shad fly flew up, and it was just flying in front of me. And at first I was doing this because I was thinking, and then I went, wait a minute. And I was looking at it, and I'm like, there it is. It's a fairy. It's not supposed to be here. I'm thinking about fairies. Mm-hmm. And there's a fly on a cold November day, just bugging the heck out of me. Right?
Trying to tell you something.
Telling me something. Yeah. And it looks like a fairy because it actually has, it's a shadfly. So it has these really big wings for its body. I don't know how to express it in any other way. Like, this is just what I think about and how I approach things. But one of the things that Berdyaev said when you were reading that about the transcendent becoming immanent, I thought the reverse is also true when that happens. The immanent becomes transcendent. Okay. So like when I recently made a spot on my property for an icon of Saint Seraphim, and I've been going out to spend time there. And when I hung the icon on a tree, I had a spot that I picked out for it, and I hung the icon, and I took the icon, the drill, all my stuff, and a rake, because I thought, well, I got to clean it up for Saint Seraphim, right? And then I put it on the tree, drilled it in place and everything. And then I went to clean up the spot, and I'm like, I can't move that pine cone. It's holy. I can't even move that stick. It was like suddenly my rake became this version of myself, my humanity, right? That wants to order everything instead of just letting it be what it is and seeing it for what it is and letting it reveal itself to me. And so and this idea of holy ground is when the immanent becomes transcendent.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it was such a humbling experience, really, because I thought my very critical voice of myself said, and see, why would you even think about bringing that rake anyways? Well, because because I'm human, because I'm missing the point.
Yeah.
That's why.
Yeah. Well, it's like what's one of the things that's like the thing that I in that specific essay that Berdyaev writes, he's playing with a lot of different ideas. So he plays off of the theosophical idea of the Third Testament, right? And that there's this new revelation afoot that's going to be on par with the Old Testament and the New Testament. They call it the Third Testament, right?
Okay.
I don't know much about the theosophical school and what they write about it. I just know that the idea comes out of theosophy. But Berdyaev is saying basically we like the Third Testament, the tension that the in between time, this time between the two comings is creating is a New Testament or a New Testament. But it's not a written one. It's us. It's the people, right? It's the living stones that comprise the house of God. And to me, like that, I think sometimes when, even in our conversations on the topic of creativity, it's easy for me to think, well, then I need to go do something creative. And that is to a degree true. Especially if you're going to work on a creative piece, you're going to have to start, you're going to have to work, you're going to have to rework, you're going to have to rework again, and then you're going to come up with a finished product, right? You got to do something. But I think there's a deeper thing at play in the question of creativity that we don't recognize quite as well, right? So, let's say like my daughter comes into me and she's upset over the way a friend treats her at school, right? And that opportunity, she's presenting a problem and an opportunity to me at the same time, right? And it's all in terms of the way I'm going to respond to her in her moment of crisis is going to determine the way that conversation unfolds and the effect it's going to have on her
and the world,
right? And so if I can engage my daughter, who I love very much, with with kindness and compassion and understanding and some parental wisdom to be able to help her navigate through that disappointing situation at school, it's going to have a profound effect on her outlook as she goes back and re-engages that friend that was mean to her. Right? And it could shape that relationship as well.
Yeah.
And that can have a long-lasting effect. And so when I think of like the creative life and what we're called to, it's not just doing knitting a sweater or writing a book or painting a painting or sculpting sculpture or making a movie. Like those are great. And by the way, if anybody wants to work on those things, please, we need more great work out there. But that's just one part of creativity. Creativity is a life that's actively engaged, that recognizes that the kingdom of God is always and everywhere present, and it's waiting for us to engage. right? So if I'm engaging in a mindful way, but if I, at the same time, that same creative call that can become a real problem if I engage with my daughter with indifference, or I'm like, I take her friend's side without really thinking through the situation, or if I'm further upsetting her in that interaction, that can have an effect. We're creating the world as we experience it, right? So to be creative from that place of awareness and that place of like, this life that I've been given is a living story that is being told in every moment I live, in every choice I make. And I can engage with that active creativity. What I am engaged in, whether it's on the small scale or on the grand scale, it is a part of building into that kingdom. It is a part of building into that reality. And I think a lot of what we take for granted is actually fundamental to the kingdom, right? The mother who raises her child up in the faith.
Oh, yeah.
That's the kingdom. The person who goes and visits the someone in a jailhouse. That's where the kingdom is, right? That's the creativity of the kingdom. Is it, we have not just been, and I think Berdyaev is right, like, we oftentimes will make Christianity about solving a sin problem. That problem is solved in the Christian message, right? But we're saved from something to something, and that to something is a creative life that we're each called to actively engage. And that is what is the hastening piece of kind of, we're talking about this tension of kind of waiting but hastening at the same time. That hastening piece is actually just the life that we live.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And all this boring in between time, we're trying to figure out when's this big thing going to happen? Well, it's happening now.
How much of agreeing, let's say, because I think, like I said, there's a choice that's being made. Agreeing and working in, what's the word I'm looking for? Cooperation with God to be creative is also saying yes to life. Right? So, like, a lot of people wonder about moral dilemmas and so on, and there's some real trolley problems out there, right? That we're all facing. So it's like, for me personally, whenever I'm faced with a choice between two things, my go-to, and it's not always easy, but my go-to is to choose life. And that's always the more difficult. It always requires more of me than the other choice. That's how I know I'm choosing it. Right?
Why do you think it requires more?
Because I think you can't. This is interesting. I had a brief interaction with Nate in some DMs about this, because I think it's about sacrifice. And I think that sacrifice, Nate was talking about sacrifice and gift as being in like opposition to each other. But I don't think that they are. I think that gift is given by God, and sacrifice is a reciprocation of the gift, right? There's an argument to be made that we don't have anything. Nothing is ours. Everything is God's, and therefore we can't sacrifice it. But we can think we're sacrificing it. Right? Just as, the free will question. Well, do you have a free will? Because, it doesn't matter. We think we have a free will.
Yeah.
Right? So,
whether it's fiction or not, it's a useful fiction.
It's a use, yeah. And so it's like, if I'm, and then I talked to Yosef about this, because there's a lot of scripture that talks about sacrifice as in contrast to obedience, right? To obey is better than sacrifice. But I think what the criticism there is that if you're sacrificing out of obligation, or you're sacrificing out of superstition,
or ritualism,
which would be a superstition,
right?
Really. It's to guarantee you a good outcome, which is a transactional move, right?
Right.
So it's mammon, and this happens. I used this example today in our online estuary group. That there are people in the Orthodox Church, often cradle Orthodox, who slide in for the Eucharist and then go home, right?
Mm-hmm.
To me, that's a superstitious move.
Mm-hmm.
That's a transactional. I got to come and get the Eucharist so that my business stays afloat. I don't get divorced. I don't have, if I die, then I go to heaven, like all the things, right?
Yeah.
And in that case, to obey is better than sacrifice, right?
Right.
But the Jews or the Israelites were going to the temple and to the tabernacle to sacrifice. They still had to sacrifice. Sacrifice didn't end just because the psalm said to obey is better than sacrifice. Right. But to go as an obedient child of God with your sacrifice because he asked you to, that's better than just sliding in for the Eucharist and then going home, right? Or acting out of superstition to guarantee you some kind of an outcome.
Yeah.
And so that's why if you choose life, you will feel it. It will cost you something. I mean, this when you have a child, which is the ultimate example, choosing life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Also,
is it Valhinger? I can't see with my glasses.
Weihinger.
Okay.
Weihinger. I've never.
Well, it's kind of made me think about, we don't know at the end of the day whether you're the biggest egg-headed scientist on the planet and you understand all the scientific mysteries, all the way down to, the superstitious, some superstitious woodsman or whatever. I mean, how much of what we think and believe and understand are just that?
Yeah.
Because the reality is so immense. And I don't think that, by the way, I'm not trying to say that Christianity is a useful fiction. I'm not trying to say that, but
no.
Oftentimes, our understandings are so rudimentary, and so much of it is just a rough sketch of the reality that we can't articulate, that we can't quite describe, and we can't fully comprehend. And so we're left with these, with kind of that fictional approach, which in some sense it moves us forward in life. And it, the narrative tension of history itself kind of creates, we're in this story, this broadly Christian story of Advent, right? Of what we're talking about, of that in between, and, left without any assurances, of the finality or the final truth of all this stuff, because it awaits completion, right? So it's like,
but don't you think though, like we're not just sitting idly by waiting for it to be, this cycle to be completed. Its completion is contingent on our participation within it.
Right.
Right. Like on our cooperation with it. Like I think Abby said something about the fiat. I don't know where she wrote that. Yeah. Agreeing. Fiat. Be it unto me according to thy word. Yeah. So there's an agreement with God, no matter what the cost, right?
Mm-hmm.
To bring life into the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't just mean having children. It means being creative.
Right.
I'm just looking for something here.
Well, I think to be creative is, in a sense, and this is, something that I, in other contexts, have to deal with quite constantly. But being creative is about taking responsibility. If you're going to create something, you're going to take responsibility for it, right? And I think of the context that we find ourselves in, just in life in general. And in life in general, like, I didn't choose to be born in the time I was born in, to the parents I was born to. I wasn't, I didn't have very little control over like native personality, the kind of traits that I inherited, all that kind of stuff. And you can, or, I didn't, the time in history I was born in, it had nothing to do with the history that preceded me, in terms of I had no real effect on it. I just find myself in the middle of this world. It's not my fault, right? And you can look at the world the way it is. You can look at life in all of its complexity and all the things that we can't control, and you can throw up your hands in the air and just say, this is chaos. There's nothing I can do with this. It's not my fault. And that's partially true. But until you can come to a point where, so I use this in a context of my own, struggle with mental illness, is like, it's not my fault that I have that, but it is my responsibility. Right.
Yeah.
And I think when we come to a place where you can take ownership and responsibility, this is the world I live in. This is what I have inherited. This is the deck of cards that I have been dealt. And it becomes my responsibility of, what do I now do with this thing, or this set of circumstances, or for me, like the bipolar disorder, what do I do with this? Well, as soon as I take responsibility for it, I'm taking ownership. Right. So even within like the apocalyptic message of Advent, and, all of the ways that certain kinds of apocalyptic thinking can warp people, that's not our fault, but it is our responsibility to think through what the problems that Advent presents to us, this problem of a delay, this problem of waiting, this problem of hastening. What do we do when we wait while we hasten, and all these kinds of things? These are a series of problems that are presented to us. And the problems aren't our fault, but they become our responsibility. What do we do with it?
Okay.
Right. And I think to be able to take responsibility doesn't mean that you're the source, or that, you're the one that's presenting the problems, but then you can take personal ownership in terms of response. And that can become that can become the impetus through which we can be creative. We can bring something new into the world that wouldn't be there unless we had acted in a certain way, or unless we had done a certain thing, right? So I think that there's a way where we can look at all of this, the whole, broad panorama of life under the sun in our present moment, and we're not disempowered. We're not helpless. There's not nothing we can do. There may be a limited amount that we can do, but we can take responsibility for what we can do. And I find that to be liberating in times where you can kind of
I'm
that element of paralysis.
trying to find this thing here. I just wanted to read. It's a part of a poem about taking responsibility for what we can do. And for some reason, I can't find it. Let me just quickly see if I can find it. What does Upcycle say there? Going back to the fairies question.
I don't know. Let's go ahead and put it up there.
La fée verte. The green fairy. Okay, well, oh gosh, I don't know why I can't find it. Let me see here one more time. Maybe I didn't.
Well, you're looking, Abby. So this is interesting what you have to say here, Abby, about the existence of an all-powerful God in heaven is a very useful fiction. And I really want to believe it again. Whether there is an all-powerful God or heaven is a question that does exist quite outside of us. Either it's true outside of us, or it's true or not true, irrespective of us, right? That kind of thing. But that question of belief, sometimes I think that those seasons of doubt and unbelief are actually fundamental to the experience of belief as well, right? So sometimes those periods of our life and our experience, and I've had them as well, are ones that where that period of doubt is just belief in the negative form. It's driving us to a new or deeper understanding. And I don't know a ton about you, Abby, but we have maybe some similar things in our upbringing. Is, those periods of doubt were what moved me from, very reductionistic, kind of a fundamentalist framework into something different, because I did have to doubt those things. I did have to engage the rational process. And somehow through that whole thing, and ups and downs, belief is kind of, it has its ebbs and flows, but that ebbing, that dipping and that lower is actually kind of it operates on a wavelength. And sometimes when it's dipping, it's not that it's not there, it's just that it's experienced in a different form.
Okay, I found my thing here. Finally. Do you want to hear it?
Yeah, I do want to hear it. You go ahead. I was just laughing at Abby's last comment.
Okay.
It's very sweet.
Okay, so he's talking to his father, and then he's thinking about his own thoughts. To be good is more than holy words or definite acts. Embodying itself unconsciously in simple forms of human helpfulness and understanding the need that prays. And when he reads the weary tales of crime and wretchedness and white-faced children sad with hunger and neglect and cruel words, he walks sadly for an afternoon, with head down bent and pondering footsteps slow, and to himself conclude, quote, "The best I can for the great world is just the best I can for this my world. The influence will go in widening circles to the darksome lanes in London's self." When a philanthropist said pompously, "With your great gifts, you ought to work for the great world, not spend yourself on common labors like a common man," he answered him, "The world is in God's hands. This part he gives to me, for which my past, built up on love inherited, has made me fittest. Neither will he let me think primeval godlike work too low to need. For its perfection, manhood's noblest power, and deepest knowledge far beyond my gifts. And for the crowds of men, in whom a soul cries through the windows of their hollow eyes, for bare humanity, and leave to grow, would I could help them. But all crowds are made of individuals, and their grief and pain and thirst and hunger, all are of the one, not of the many. And the power that helps enters the individual and extends thence in 1,000 gentle influences to other hearts. It is not made one's own by laying hold of an allotted share of general good divided faithfully. Now here I labor whole upon the place, his farm, where they have known me from my childhood up. I know the individual man, and he knows me. If there is power in me to help, it goes forth beyond the present will, clothing itself in very common deeds of any humble day's necessity. I would not always consciously do good, not always feel a helper of the men, who make me feel full return for my poor deeds, which I must do for my own sake, if I have forgot my brethren for themselves, by human trust and confidence of eyes that look me in the face and hands that do my work at will, is more than I deserve. But in the city, with a few lame words and a few scanty handfuls of weak coin, misunderstood, or at the best unknown. I should toil on and seldom reach the mail. And if I leave the thing that lies next, to go and do the thing that is far away, I take the very strength out of my deed, seeking the needy, not for pure need's sake.
And what was this from?
This is from The Hidden Life by George MacDonald. It's a really long poem. I read it once on the channel, and I think it took me an hour to read the whole thing. But he's talking about, and here's the thing, George MacDonald was very charitable, like to the poor and the needy. Mm-hmm. But in this story, it's about letting your, and this is always his thing, letting your light shine, doing the thing that God asks you to do. And so for this character in the poem, he chooses not to become a scholar. He graduates with honors, and that's the kind of the gist of the reading that I gave you, was that the philanthropist is like, you're too smart for this. What are you doing working on a farm? Mm-hmm. You need to be out there doing great things for the world. And he says, the world is in God's hands. This part that I have is in my hands. Right? And I remember when I ran across that and was reading it, at the time, I hadn't fully thought through all of these things, but I remember thinking, yes, that's exactly right. Because that's how the temple not made by hands gets built, right? And then like he says, it comes from the one heart. The one heart sheds, beams it out in 1,000 different influences. And that's why I could say, when you said that when you had that conversation with your daughter, it matters to the world how you do that, Jed.
Right.
To the whole world.
Right. And because things are so often, like a lot of the things in our lives are so seemingly common. For me, like I'll be waiting for that big moment.
We're always waiting for our big moment.
As it's happening right in front of me.
Sure, exactly.
Coming to me in the form of my daughter, right?
Yes.
I wanted to comment on something that one of the comments here, but what was really interesting is like when you're reading from MacDonald there, it's like what I'm hearing is like, this is how the kingdom is built.
Yes.
Right. But there was a comment in here, William left it. This is really an important thing. And I think that we, like, when we're talking about the realm of belief, it's where I think we have to understand that there's different ways of knowing, and the rational mind, right? The mind is a place where skepticism and doubt have to exist. Like I need to have a certain amount of skepticism if I'm encountering a new situation where there's a bunch of unknowns. There's a certain caution you have to proceed with. As a scientist, you have to start with doubt, right? Mm-hmm. That's part of your experimentation process, is to have that doubt. So that's a rational thing. That's a rational tool. Doubt is actually useful, but that's not the only way we know things, right? We know things at the level of intuition. We know things in our heart. We know things in that all-encompassing sense of wisdom. We know things through wonder, through awe. And so there's different ways and modes of knowing and being in the world. And I think in the Western world, everything gets reduced to, does it make rational sense? Right. And there's room for doubt in any of those kind of questions. But there's other areas where a doubt in the mind is actually much easier to overcome than a doubt in the heart. Right.
Yeah. Here's the thing, doubt and skepticism. I'm gonna say some bold things, but I just feel like saying what I'm thinking about.
Sure.
Doubt and skepticism should be the impetus for curiosity, and not for cynicism.
Right.
And I think that they end up becoming cynical because we have grown up in a culture enriched by the idea that if you doubt something, you're not a believer.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And so doubt has been labeled as a bad thing and as something that you need to avoid. Now, of course, atheists have jumped on the doubt bandwagon and said we need to doubt everything because we were what? Never allowed to doubt.
Right.
So everyone has taken doubt in the wrong way. And that's why I say doubt should be the impetus for curiosity. You know, I'm not sure about that.
Well, I think
And,
a
a lot of people want to sweep it away. Well, they either want to sweep it away, or what would be the other response to that? Or prove that it's true. So you either get the hand waving, dismissive, Sam Harris mythological.
Like the critic versus the apologist.
I can turn it, versus the apologist. I can turn a cookbook into a sacred text. See, right?
Right.
And
which, depending on the cookbook, they may be right.
Well, I think cookbooks are sacred texts because I think cooking is very spiritual.
Right.
But anyway, don't tell Sam Harris I said that.
Right.
Just make a sourdough bread. It's a very spiritual experience, let me tell you.
Well, it's like I think that it's like that legacy of rationalism, like where unless something is rationally true or not true is the basis of whether we're going to believe or not believe. But something's true irrespective of whether we recognize it or not, right? Like something that is true is not true because it's rational. It's true because it's true. We can make sense of it because it is rational, right? And I think that there's so much of an emphasis, especially here in the West, on that rationalistic understanding that maybe would laugh at the question of like enchantment or those kinds of things. But when you look at knowing as encompassing more than just the rational process, there's more going on. I know I love my daughter, and I could probably give you some rational reasons as to why, but it doesn't rest on rationale. It rests on something that's far deeper and far more prior to any reason at all.
Right. But you could take the the reason thing. You could take reason and you could talk about what you were talking about earlier about the contradictions, reconciling these two contradictory things, right? And which is what a poet does, or a good novelist, right? Is you take two contradictory things and you show how they fit together to make something completely different, which is a marriage and the conception of a child. That's what it is. Two contradictory things. They don't even have the same shape, right?
Yeah.
Their shapes are complementary. They're not the same. Like they're literally made to fit each other.
Yeah.
And out of that union of contradiction comes a new life, right?
Right.
So, what was I going to say about that? If you're using your reason, they remain contradictions. And you can only deal with one or the other of them. Hi, Abby. Abby's waiting. But if you look at them incarnationally or within a poetic framework, they become one thing. They become reconciled, right?
Absolutely.
And the end, they reveal a deeper truth, like something new, like a child. And another mystery, actually.
This is so true.
What a person is.
Abby, what's going on? How are you?
Hey. Well, I paused this stream because I was reading this poems or a series of poems by Franny Choi. and her book is called The World Keeps Ending and the World Goes On. And then it like hit me as like basically what the stream was talking about. So I'm like, oh, okay, this is appropriate.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, it's actually kind of perfectly the whole theme of it seems like a big through line of her work, obviously given the title of her book, and then these poems are like about that too, I think. Well, it's more about apocalypse, but I mean, same difference.
Okay. Well, were you going to share some of it with us?
Yeah, I've been sending to my friends. I said this is my Thanksgiving my Thanksgiving poems. And there are a series of 4 poems, but I think only 3 of them are relevant to, I don't know. I'm only going to read 3 of them.
Okay.
Should I though? I should probably. I mean, I should finish it. The truth is, honestly, she is Korean, and so her poetry, a lot of it is about that and like the legacy of her people and everything. And I'm not Korean, and I don't know a ton about Korean history, so like some of that kind of loses me when she is very specific about it, and I'm always like picking at the like very abstract, high level stuff, and I think that says something unfortunate about me, but like,
Well, George
it's
MacDonald would say maybe
can't
your
take it away.
meaning is how does he put that? Maybe your meaning is better than what she meant, because in that one imagination essay, the fictional character poses the question, well, how do I know I'm getting your meaning out of it? And he says, well, maybe your meaning is superior to mine.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say superior because it's like I'm abstracting and taking to my own person, and like yeah, I don't know. There's
Well,
a
I'm
reason
not
why her
saying that it
poetry
is
is about
superior,
that.
but
It's
yeah.
very much grounded in the history of
Well, it might be superior to
World
you,
War II
though,
and everything.
for
But
you.
yeah, the part of it that I can use is not the part of it that's specifically about that. But I also am not going to excise it because that's why she's writing it and it's important. Anyway, let me see. So did you finish saying what you were? Did I like interrupt anything?
No, not at all. Please do. This is, live stream type stuff. This is anything goes.
Yeah. This poem is insane. Everything she's so good. Okay, so all of the poems are called the same title. So I'll just like pause between them because they all have the same title.
Okay.
So, upon learning that some Korean War refugees used partially detonated napalm canisters as cooking fuel. I mean, honestly, I think that kind of speaks for itself. I could probably just stop there. But she's great and elaborates on it. Well, anyway. Somewhere in a prior world, a woman with my face is scraping the seeds from an unborn hell. All night, doom rang from the sky, and in the morning, there are mouths to feed. There are crocks in the cellar, and the ruined crops, the early frost, the neighbor's red daughter strung up in the square. What else to do when the unspeakable comes? What to burn when it doesn't? Somewhere, in a world that didn't quite end, a woman like me is foraging for that which failed to kill her. She is cranking open modernity's throat, wrenching her arc from its scat. She is a woman who can hack an impossible morning into water, bean paste, bitter leaves. Another chance to fumble toward the next chance and the next. Every day of my life has been something other than my last. Every day, an extinction misfires, and I put it to work. If a part-way bomb, if a half-paused hell, if a killing failed, can feed, if a death sentence, incomplete, if a horror flopped, if extinction unlocks its jaw, if what doesn't kill you makes you, if almost, if never, if the friction of did not succeed, If someone harnessed annihilation in service of a stew, if someone me-like can see disaster's refuse and think dinner, if they can gather reeds and soften them with the genius of unconsummated doom, if I can almost love the bomb that didn't burst, then, if a war didn't end, if the war that didn't end helps me eat, if my swelling ends no hunger but my own, if my hunger ends not a thing. How did we get here, you'll think, kneeling with your neighbors in the parking lot as the para-police confiscate your coffee. How did it get to this, everyone will say, walking north on the interstate as the cities swarmed in orange, swallowed in smoke. How did this happen? Though it'll be the wrong question, as they tear open your packages, escort you to a room where white-knuckled soldiers wait. Listen, I have a bad imagination. Dystopia is the word for what's already happened so many times. It's the reason is so cheap. No such thing as an undetonated hell. The pilot light clicks, and I eat. I lie on the floor, partially bursting, partially stripped by the fact, drowning in the fact, slobbering like a dog in the heat of the fact. Here, on the other side of what happened. Oh, I think I should reread the title with this one, because I think this is kind of shifting a little bit from talking about that scene to then talking about the aftermath of Burning Lot. So, upon learning that some Korean War refugees used partially detonated napalm canisters as cooking fuel, I lie on the floor, partially bursting. Wait, like the partially stripped by the fact, drowning in the fact, slobbering like a dog in the heat of the fact. Here, on the other side of what happened, I make nothing happen, nothing, 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 placid as a gerund, dead trees sharpening the sky. Once upon a time, the people whose nightmares I inherited were safe, then they weren't, hence they were never safe. They survived however they could. They made daughters who married well and were proud in ordinary ways, or they were ashamed. Days passed. They chased vultures from their mothers, were stuffed with bloody rags, watched fire shock their limbs into myth. Days and days. Here, in the inconceivable future, I am unable to narrate, to speak in the simple past, facts lined up like soldiers on a horizon. I'm making nothing happen but my own drool, drooling, gaping, chomping at the ing, ing, ing. I make a nothing that whirs into being, feedback looping into a buzzsaw of nothing, dome of nothing. So big it rises, big enough to keep my people safe from the catastrophes that rain from planes. Before each catastrophe, a moment in which my people are safe. Refuge of nothing, refuge of uneventfulness, first days, then days and days. In a dead tree's heart, an empty space. In the space, a small animal, useless, beautiful animal, stretching its wings, wings, wings.
What was the author's name once again?
Franny Choi.
Franny Choi. I'm gonna actually put that into my search bar so I don't forget it. Thanks, Abby.
She's really, really good. Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Oh, fantastic. Okay. So how do you feel like that? I mean, there's so much there, but tell me, like, how do you feel like that connects into kind of this theme of Advent and apocalypse and waiting?
Oh my God. Yeah, I mean, so much of it, like, speaks for itself, and I feel like I'm just gonna kind of make a mess of it,
Oh,
but
please make a mess,
to
Abby.
draw
Come
it
on.
out, but yeah, that's what has to be done. But yeah, I guess, like, there's a lot of interesting well, it's kind of like we've been talking about of, like, contrasts and contradictions. Obviously, this whole poem is kind of about holding really horrible or just, like, unthinkable contradictions both within this scene of, like, freaking napalm canisters, exploding your livelihood and your world and everything, and then using that to eat, it just I don't know, that's such an image, and then also the tension of, like, well, that's actually something that happened in the world to
Mhm,
especially if you're her, to her people, um, and how do you, like, live after that, and how do you talk about it, and how do you reconcile it? How do you learn about, like, what do you do with that? And so those are both just huge contrasts. I guess there's a and then I think also so those are the contrasts, and then I think also, like, Advent and the first and the second coming is supposed to be well, it's generally hailed as, like, a good thing, right? Like, a good apocalyptic thing, like, God will come into the world, and especially the second time, making things better and fixing things. I guess in modernity, we think of apocalypse more like that.
mhm.
And as the inevitable, like, destruction of all things. And that's kind of the image that we live with. And I think that's interesting. Like, those two kind of visions of a world falling apart. That's an interesting contrast. And I the the central image of someone taking a partially detonated bomb and then using that to eat obviously ties into, like, well, I was using it for Thanksgiving because of, all the eating and Thanksgiving stuff,
Mhm.
and then communion and all of that. Of course, I feel like that's a very crucial in the sense of crux, in the sense of cross, like, image of taking death and bringing it into life and taking and I yeah, yeah, it's so beautiful.
Well, and the extremes of that poem, like it made me when I was listening to it, I was thinking of like um, those napalm bombs that occupy our lives, right? Maybe not at the same extreme of an actual napalm bomb, but in a sense, like we've all gone through, or if you've lived long enough. I mean, some people go through it very early too, but you live long enough, and there's going to be certain times in your life where it just blows up, right? Or it almost blows up, or you can see the threat coming through. Um, and I look back on some of those instances and moments in my own life, and these things that were destructive and painful or threatening, or all the cacophony of bad things combining into one chaotic mess, right? Has become those memories become something different over time, right? They become something useful that I can make my stew with, right? And I think that that broader apocalyptic sense of Advent being it's coming. Christ's first Advent came into a period of an epoch of history that was incredibly violent, right?
Right. I think
And
that's like an kind of Advent image in a way of the idea of her taking this bomb and then kind of you can see cradling it and bringing something to yeah.
yeah, there's that piece there, and in
Put the
some
napalm
senses,
bomb in the nativity scene. Sorry.
yeah,
I
and
don't
so
mean to interrupt. I'm making like yeah.
well, and there's that there's like a courage of being able to take those the fragility of our own lives and the reality of the wreckage that we're all going to have to encounter in some way, and be able to make something of it, right? The bomb isn't your fault, but all of a sudden it's become your responsibility. You got to do something with this thing. And she makes a stew, right? She takes all that destructive power and force, and make something useful of it.
Well, isn't that the same metaphor that the scripture uses about turning the weapons into plowshares?
Right. Right.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, hey, ladies, I would love to talk further, but I had to kind of budget a couple of hours and I got to
Sure.
get with family. I don't know. I can keep it going or we can.
No, that's good. I should go too, actually.
Yeah. But Abby, thank you for jumping in. I love that poem. We've got to get on live chat more often because I love the things you have to say and your cool haircut, by the way, too. So, anyway, and Sherry, it's great to see you. And for everybody that tuned in tonight, thank you so much. And hopefully, as we get further into the Advent season, you can enjoy your Advent readings, and that is a special time of reflection for each of you. But anyway, I'm gonna hang things up here unless there's any objections. We're good.
It's all good. Happy Thanksgiving to my American friends.
All right, take care. Bye.
Oh.
Oh.